Today we're going to look back at 20 suppers that helped Canadians stay warm before the hum of furnaces replaced the sound of pots on the stove. From prairie farmhouses to maritime row houses, these were the meals that thawed hands after shoveling snow and filled kitchens with a damp, comforting heat. Dominion Bureau household reports from the 1960s listed stew, beans, and casseroles among the nation's most common winter dishes, accounting for nearly one-third of all home-cooked meals. In a country where February could still freeze laundry solid on the line, supper often doubled as central heating. Meatloaf anchored the week for countless small-town families. Ground beef sold for about 45 cents a pound in 1965, less than half the price of steak, and could stretch to feed 5 when mixed with crumbs and evaporated milk. The sound of a fork beating eggs in a ceramic bowl and the smell of ketchup glaze caramelizing on top became signals that another long day was ending. CBC's Homemaker's Notebook called it the modern Canadian roast, inexpensive, predictable, and democratic. Served beside mashed potatoes and canned corn from Dominion stores, it tasted like hard work made edible, a quiet triumph over another cold evening. Pea soup offered the same reassurance farther east. Yellow split peas at 8 cents a pound and a ham bone left from Sunday dinner created a broth thick enough to coat a spoon. Steam fogged the windows of kitchens from Montreal to Moncton while salt pork hissed gently in the pot. Provincial surveys from 1958 credited Quebec households with the nation's highest pea consumption, nearly 12 ounces per person weekly. The meal's secret was patience, 3 hours of slow bubbling that turned thrift into flavor. Served with brown bread and a curl of butter, it filled more than stomachs. It restored the feeling that the house itself was alive again. Saturday nights in the Maritimes carried the scent of baked beans, sweetened with molasses. Families soaked the beans overnight, then baked them all day in heavy stone crocks. Molasses from St. John refineries sold for 20 cents a tin, making it one of the cheapest flavorings available. By the time hockey night in Canada signed off, the beans were ready, dark, sticky, and rich enough to perfume the house till morning. Sociologists later noted that bean night served as an informal ritual of togetherness, neighbors dropping in, bread still warm, the radio humming against the cold. In a landscape where isolation defined winter, supper created community. Stew followed close behind as the season's essential survival food. Butchers in Toronto and Saskatoon sold stewing beef for about 50 cents a pound during the 1960s, and every cut went into the pot. Potatoes, carrots, and turnips from basement bins turned thin gravy into something that could feed 6. Dominion Bureau nutrition surveys recorded that Canadians consumed nearly 160 pounds of root vegetables per person yearly by 1964, proof of how much bulk the cold demanded. The stew's slow rhythm matched the weather outside, long, unhurried, inevitable. When the lid finally lifted, the room smelled of salt and metal and safety, boots drying by the register while frost crept along the floorboards. For quick meals, macaroni mixed with ground beef, called goulash in some kitchens, filled plates from Winnipeg to Windsor. 1 pound of beef, 1 tin of tomatoes, half a box of elbow noodles, and supper was ready in 20 minutes. Chatelain's 1962 Budget Week issue featured 3 versions, each promising to feed a family of 5 for under $1. The hiss of the pot, the orange glow of cheese melting on top created comfort that required no ceremony. For families living paycheck to paycheck, goulash wasn't just food, it was proof that a warm, full table was still possible after a week of bills. No single product defined post-war convenience more than Kraft Dinner. Marketed as the 9-minute meal, it sold for 25 cents a box in 1957 and accounted for almost 10 million boxes annually by decade's end. The bright orange sauce powder became part of Canada's national identity, eaten in dorms, basements, and mining town trailers alike. Parents returning from late shifts at Loblaws or the paper mill could serve it with sliced hot dogs and know that no one would complain. Historians later called it the taste of modernity. At the time, it was simply hot, cheap, and easy, exactly what a winter evening required. On the prairies, cabbage rolls represented both heritage and endurance. Immigrant families taught neighbors to boil cabbage leaves until soft, then wrap them around rice and minced pork before baking them in tomato sauce. Wheat Board reports from 1961 noted that Manitoba communities of Ukrainian descent produced more homegrown cabbages than any other province. Church cookbooks preserved hundreds of variations, each claiming authenticity. The smell of baking cabbage and tomatoes filled community halls, where folding tables trembled under enamel pans. It wasn't fine dining. It was survival woven into tradition, a dish that kept body and culture intact when the snowdrifts reached the windowsills. By the time supper was cleared, the house had changed. Frost still framed the panes, but the air was thicker, heavy with salt, steam, and the comfort of something earned. These early meals didn't just keep people full. They kept the cold at bay long enough to remind everyone what warmth really meant. Tourtière was the pride of countless Quebec kitchens through the long, dark winters. A deep pie filled with spiced pork or minced beef, it was built to last and meant to be shared. Recipes varied from family to family. Some used cloves, others a touch of cinnamon, but the smell was unmistakable once it escaped the oven. Department of Agriculture bulletins from 1959 described it as the French-Canadian answer to cold weather cooking, noting that ground meat at 50 cents a pound and home-rendered lard kept it within reach of every household. Across rural parishes, the pie cooled slowly on open windowsills while snow squeaked under boots outside. It didn't just feed the family, it reminded everyone that celebration could still live inside the ordinary. In Newfoundland and parts of rural Ontario, the humblest sandwich in the country carried the loudest sizzle. Bologna, fried in thick slices until its edges curled, turned a simple piece of white bread into a family supper. Processed meats cost barely 30 cents a pound in 1962 and stayed fresh even when fridges were half empty. Cooks dropped the slices onto cast iron pans slicked with bacon grease, the sharp smell of salt and smoke cutting through damp kitchen air. Children could hear that sound from outside and know exactly what was for dinner. It was quick, it was cheap, and it tasted like comfort bought honestly at the end of a week's work. When money stretched far enough for a proper casserole, many turned to shepherd's pie, layers of beef, carrots, and peas sealed beneath mashed potatoes browned under the broiler. Wartime cookbooks reissued by Chatelaine and the Women's Institute promoted it as the most efficient way to reuse leftovers. Potatoes at 5 cents a pound and ground beef at 40 cents meant a full meal for under $1. The dish went into the oven just as the thermostat began to drop, its warmth creeping from the kitchen into narrow hallways lined with wool coats. Long after supper, that scent clung to drapes and mittens like proof that the family had eaten well. Farther east, Acadian families turned to chicken fricot, a stew thick with broth and soft dumplings that could stretch one bird for 3 days. The recipe came from times when ingredients were few and flavor was coaxed from patience. In 1964, the National Dairy Council noted that families in northern New Brunswick still simmered fricot as a mainstay meal through January and February. On days when wood piles ran low and roads disappeared under snow, the bubbling of that pot became the evening's only comfort. Steam coated the windows and left lace patterns on the glass, while the smell of onions and salt fat made every corner of the house feel alive. For those who lived near the Atlantic, the end of a week often meant fish cakes and pickles. Cod or salt pollock mashed with leftover potatoes, shaped into small patties, and fried until golden, offered the kind of meal that didn't waste a thing. Canners in Lunenburg and Harbor Grace shipped over 30 million pounds of salted fish annually during the 1950s, and much of it ended up reborn this way. A jar of homemade cucumber relish, vinegar bright and sugary, cut through the oil and salt. The sound of frying carried through thin walls, and families counted patties as they came off the pan, hoping the cook might look away long enough for someone to steal one. It was food made from the edges of plenty. Liver and onions divided more households than politics. Some couldn't stand the smell, others swore by it. But at 35 cents a pound, liver provided the best source of iron money could buy, and doctors on CBC radio praised its sturdy nutrition. The onions were sliced thin, dredged in flour, and fried until sweet enough to mask the metallic scent. Across the country, school cafeterias served it weekly, and at home mothers persisted, insisting it was good for you, even as children pushed it to the edge of their plates. The taste may have been contested, but the intention, keeping families healthy through hard winters, was universally understood. In towns scattered across Manitoba and Saskatchewan, pierogies formed another layer of Canadian warmth. Dough folded around mashed potatoes, cheese, or sauerkraut filled long trestle tables in community halls where women gathered to roll and pinch. During the early 1970s, prairie wheat prices hit record highs, but families still devoted flour to pierogies for Sunday meals. Served with fried onions and thick sour cream, they represented the shared heritage of hundreds of immigrant families who had turned fields of wheat into permanent homes. The hiss of butter in the skillet, the soft weight of dough in the hand, those were the sounds of belonging. When cupboards thinned, canned meats filled the gap, and corned beef hash became the dependable fallback. A tin of corned beef at 40 cents mixed with 2 potatoes at 10 cents made enough for 3 plates. The metallic click of the key opening the can echoed through kitchens across Ontario and British Columbia alike. Once browned in a pan with onions, the scent transformed from dull to delicious, and families leaned over chipped plates grateful for what they had. Dominion Bureau statistics from 1963 showed canned beef sales peaking at nearly 8 million pounds a year, proof that convenience could still feel like care. If there was a night when everyone hoped for something a little better, it was Sunday, when pork chops sometimes appeared with applesauce spooned from a jar. Butchers in Winnipeg listed pork at 52 cents a pound in 1966, still a stretch for many. Families saved for it, treating each chop like a small luxury. The sizzle of meat hitting the pan mixed with the sweet smell of simmering apples, and for a moment the house felt richer than it was. It was proof that thrift could still taste like celebration. Split pea and ham casseroles were the midweek invention of leftovers, another dish that filled houses with the smell of smoke and salt. The Toronto Star's Home Economics column in 1961 called it a prairie reheating miracle. Mothers layered cooked peas, diced ham, and breadcrumbs, letting it bake slowly while they folded laundry near the warm oven. The oil furnace in the corner clicked on and off, pushing waves of dry heat into a kitchen already thick with steam. By the time it came to the table, the top was golden, the center dense and creamy. It might not have looked elegant, but it brought silence to the room, always the sign of a good meal. Some nights called for salmon loaf, made from the same canned fish that had crossed the country by rail. Mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and a splash of lemon juice, it baked in Pyrex dishes that clattered softly when set down on kitchen tables. The Department of Fisheries reported that British Columbia's salmon exports tripled between 1955 and 1965, and cans too dented for sale often stayed in Canada, destined for family pantries. The loaf was served with peas and a drizzle of lemon sauce, its mildness hiding the truth that it had started as leftovers. It fed quiet pride as much as hunger, proof that even tinned fish could taste like comfort in the right hands. By the middle of the decade, beef and barley soup had become a national habit, recommended by newspapers as the frugal cook's insurance against cold. A pound of bones from the butcher, a handful of barley, and hours of slow simmering created the thick, glossy broth that marked a long winter afternoon. The smell drifted through hallways, past drying scarves and mittens hanging over the vent, until it met the cold seeping through thin windows. For many it was the smell of safety, slow, steady, and certain. Scalloped potatoes with bits of ham often finished the week, filling the oven with creamy heat as snow tapped against window panes. Potatoes, onions, and milk were layered one over another, ending with breadcrumbs that browned perfectly by supper time. The sound of the oven door closing was as familiar as the sound of hockey on the radio. By the late 1960s, these dishes still defined the Canadian table. When families finally sat down, plates steaming in the yellow glow of kitchen light, the week's worries thinned just enough to feel manageable. These weren't just dinners, they were small victories, eaten slowly while winter pressed hard against the glass. Long before the steady hum of central heating filled Canadian homes, warmth came from the kitchen. It began with the rattle of a match striking against the stove, the soft sigh of a burner catching, and the first trace of heat curling toward cold glass. Across the country, families built their comfort one meal at a time. Prairie winds could shake the walls, Atlantic storms could cut power for days, but as long as something simmered, the house never felt entirely cold. The oven door opened and everyone seemed to lean toward it. In those decades between the 1950s and 1970s, supper wasn't just food. It was resourcefulness measured in dollars and cents, in paychecks that had to cover coal, rent, and groceries all at once. Women's pages in the Toronto Star and Chatelaine printed advice on stretching roasts and recycling leftovers, while radio hosts on CBC reminded listeners that thrift was its own kind of care. The Dominion Bureau's household surveys recorded that the average family spent nearly one-third of its income on food in 1962, far more than today. The numbers explain why casseroles, stews, and pies dominated the dinner table. They offered both warmth and reassurance, two currencies worth more than money. Each province carried its own version of that endurance. In Quebec, tourtière baked through Christmas week, its spiced filling reminding families that celebration never needed extravagance. On the prairies, pierogies and cabbage rolls tied neighbors together across snowy distances, the shared work of rolling and filling dough becoming its own language of care. Out east, baked beans, fricot, and fish cakes connected generations through scent alone, the same smells rolling out of kitchen windows year after year. And in Ontario and British Columbia, where industry pulled people from small towns into expanding cities, quick suppers like Kraft Dinner, macaroni, and hash became symbols of independence. They were modest, modern, and achievable, the flavor of a new kind of life. These dinners stitched themselves into the rhythm of ordinary evenings. You could hear them in every neighborhood, radios murmuring on the counter, kettles whistling on the stove, the thud of boots at the door. Before the quiet click of thermostats, warmth had to be earned moment by moment. The kitchen became the heart of the house, not by design, but by necessity. Its heat crept under doors, along hallways, into bedrooms where children read library books beneath heavy quilts. Even the smallest meal carried the promise that tomorrow would start warm again. The machinery of comfort was changing fast. By the late 1960s, oil or wood stoves had given way to furnaces, and the first electric ranges appeared in suburban developments from Halifax to Vancouver. Canadian living celebrated them as signs of progress. Cleaner, easier, faster. But something intangible disappeared with the soot. The rhythm of slow cooking, the shared attention it demanded gave way to convenience foods and ready-made mixes. The kitchen grew quieter, the smells less distinct. Yet in memory, that older way of cooking feels truer. The hiss of steam, the clatter of lids, and the talk between people who stayed near the stove simply because it was warm there. Those mid-century kitchens were small but never empty. Countertops held tins of carnation milk, bags of red rose tea, and recipe cards smudged with flour. Frosted windows framed the lives of a country learning to prosper while never forgetting what it meant to stretch. The meals might have been plain, but they carried pride. Tourtière cooling on the sill, beans thick in the pot, meatloaf sliced neatly under a dinner knife, all small signs that a household could stand firm through another storm. In a land where distance and weather tested people daily, food became the gentlest form of resilience. By the early 1970s, Canada itself had changed. Supermarkets replaced corner shops, and new highways linked cities once isolated by snowdrifts and gravel roads. Convenience promised progress, but older recipes lingered, passed quietly between generations. A grandmother's handwriting might still say, "Add more molasses if it tastes too sharp," or "Don't rush the stew. It needs time to think." Those notes, tucked between pages of cookbooks, carried more than instructions. They carried affection preserved through repetition. Every meal in those years told a small story of belonging. The clang of enamel pans, the tick of the clock above the stove, the way families paused to say grace before serving. These were national rituals disguised as ordinary moments. The details changed from coast to coast, but the feeling never did. The same smell of onions browning in butter drifted through a miner's bungalow in Sudbury and a fisherman's house in Yarmouth. Across thousands of kilometers, people recognized one another by the smell of supper. When you look back at that time, at those houses that held heat only where the stove burned, it becomes clear how these meals did more than feed people. They taught patience and pride. They proved that care could be measured in ladles and wooden spoons. The food may have cooled quickly once the fire went out, but its memory never did. Even now, half a century later, those same dishes carry a quiet authority. They appear at church suppers, at Canada Day potlucks, and in kitchens where younger generations try to taste what their grandparents once knew. They remind us that warmth has never been only a matter of temperature. It's the sound of an oven door closing, the sight of steam against glass, the pause of shared silence after the first bite, when everyone realizes it tastes exactly as it used to. Across the country, from the Rockies to the Atlantic, from prairie plains to coastal towns, these dinners carried more than flavor. They carried patience, thrift, and love. Long after central heating arrived, they remained proof of how Canada kept itself warm. One meal, one pot, and one family at a time.